kind of my final thoughts. So at this point, I'll take some questions, first from Professor Craw, and then I should take a moment to introduce Dr. Miller, who just came in as the presentation was underway. He's the director of the Longitudinal Study of American Youth, who I've been working with for the past year. I had him read over my paper. He'll ask some questions, and then I'll kind of open up to anyone else. So.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I think one of the things that's really remarkable about the talk you've given is the way in which you've cleverly reused a data set. Mm-hmm. And just to explain, if you aren't familiar with longitudinal data sets, what you do in that kind of a study is you take an initial cohort of people and then you interview them over and over again over a period of years. So for obvious reasons, that's a very expensive sort of study to undertake, and so these kinds of studies are very rare. And so Jeff was able to take something that was pointed initially to evaluate scientific literacy over time and turn it into a study about political participation. I think it's a very clever reuse of what's very expensive and very, very, very valuable data. So I think that's one of the things that's really commendable about the kind of analysis you've done.
Okay, thank you.
What I'd like to ask is if you could talk a little bit more about what went into some of the key variables. So you walked us through what went into parent political participation. Could you say a few more words about the kinds of questions that went into forming the student participation variable, which is really the key focal point of the analysis, and then maybe also the civic orientation variable?
Yeah, absolutely. To go back, I guess there's not really a good slide to illustrate. Like I said, there were three main dimensions that we were looking at here. We were looking at political participation, civic orientations, and media consumption. I kind of went through what parent participation looked like, because I did each of these for parents and then for students, and then for young adults in some instances, particularly in the instance of participation. In the instance of participation and in the instance of political orientations. So I kind of went over what parent participation looked like. Young adult participation looked very much similar. Obviously, the Did You Vote in 1984 became Did You Vote in 1992. But yeah, are you a registered voter? Have you contacted a political official? I think might have been in there. There was some more data available in that set about campaign activities. Have you worked on campaigns, stuffed envelopes, worn a button, told your friends who to vote for, things like that. So those were additionally factored into creating that measure. Going on to the civic orientations, these were the ones that really worked the best, I think. In that the LSAY had a battery of questions asking both how well informed do you feel on these issues, and in the case of parents, how often do you discuss this with your children, and how often do you discuss these with your parents in the case of the students. And so it was really easy to look at all those issues, kind of combine all those issues, and have the same set of issues for parents and students in both discussion and how well informed they feel. And then I actually, when constructing those, wound up constructing them separately and then only recombining them in the final model, because that was how they happened to load better. But it's a combination of how well informed they feel and the extent to which they discuss political issues. Then the media consumption variables, were essentially just a measure of how often do you watch television, how often do you read newspapers, how often do you read news magazines. And actually, I mentioned there being some measurement issues with parent media. One of the problems with it was that there really wasn't a straightforward measure of how often do you read magazines. How often do you read news magazines, specifically, was the question that was in the student survey. And instead, it just asked them what magazines they read. So I kind of had to go back and construct my own measure because it was like, out of the top 5 magazines they read, how many of those were news magazines. So it was a bit rougher a measure, and as a result of that, when I performed the confirmatory factor analysis, the variables, the factor loading scores were all very different from one another, for one thing, and for another thing, we did a measure of inter-item reliability, basically how well these items statistically fit together. and it was just very low. Like a level, the number for significance is usually like 0.7, and this loaded at a 0.2. So it really, so that was something I kind of had to wind up figuring out what to do with, and it ultimately didn't factor into the final models in terms of media. So I just kind of kept it in there for some structural reasons and to show, hey, I learned something. Does that pretty much answer your question? Was there more you were looking for?
That's fine.
Okay.
I think maybe Professor Miller would like to pose the question.
Well, let me say, I think this is a very excellent paper, Jim. I really enjoyed looking at it. And in fact, when we started this longitudinal study, we did intend always to measure citizenship and socialization. What we didn't intend to do was to replicate Jennings and Nemi, which we certainly were aware of, but sort of chose not to do that. But I think inadvertently over time, we did in fact do that. And I was very pleased when you put together all the items because we didn't set out to actually replicate that. We set out to look at the whole range of other things. But one of the questions let me pose to you, and I think this is an outstanding piece of work by the way.
Thank you.
This is with a few minor tweaks, it will be a publishable piece. One of the assumptions you're making in this model is that major change in the two generations is in the students. Well, if you thought much about it, have you thought much about the possibility of changes in the parents? That perhaps the socialization is not the parents aren't very good at it. They may have changed what they want to socialize you to do, so that the causal arrow can come from both ends. I mean, it can be the students are behaving differently, and I think they certainly live in a different era.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
The parents may also be changing. So, if you thought much about how the model would look if the parents are changing.
I have, to a certain extent. I mean, I think this increase in mass media, while it's most strongly going to affect students because, like I said, their minds are just more open to influence, it affects all of us. And I think you're going to see those parents, I think you're going to see that the generation of parents before them, or the current generation of parents watches more TV and has that same broader view than the generation of parents before them. And maybe, to construct another model of just the parents might be useful. But I do know, for example, and this was one of the reasons I wound up leaving parent media into some of the other models. What didn't wind up in the presentation was kind of a composite model where all of the smaller models were put together into kind of one big, huge mess. And that was where it was probably most useful in the context of the paper, keeping parent media in, was adding parent and student media into that big combined model. You saw a very high relationship between parent and student media, and they both kind of worked together in there. So I think you did see that parents were more media driven. Parents, this was what the parents were slowly coming into as well. And it was just going to be, in effect, it's going to be expressed more strongly in students because it's all they've ever known. And I mean, I think going back going all the way back to that graph at the very beginning, I mean, it's definitely a pretty steady rise through age groups that older people vote more, younger people vote less. It's not just the youngest aren't voting, because it's probably not worth going all the way back. But so yeah, I think that's definitely. I think there's changes all around going on, but I think a focus on the students and a focus on how they have the power to change things, I think is kind of what was most useful to branch off of.